People often say that Berserk is about fighting monsters. They're only half right, because the most terrifying monster in Berserk isn't an apostle or even Griffith. It's an idea so deeply human that almost everyone has believed it at least once. That if only the pain would stop, everything would finally be okay. Berserk isn't really asking why people become evil. It's asking something much more uncomfortable. What would you sacrifice if suffering finally had an escape? On the surface, Berserk looks like a brutal story about revenge, fate, and survival. But beneath all the blood and violence lies a different conflict. Again and again, the series places its characters in front of unbearable suffering. Some endure it, others search for a way out. And the moment they decide that any price is worth escaping their pain, they stop being fully human. The real villain of Berserk isn't Griffith. It's the human desire to escape suffering at any cost. No character embodies this more clearly than Griffith. For years, Griffith endures humiliation, poverty, political manipulation, and impossible ambition, all while chasing a dream that gives meaning to every sacrifice he makes. His identity becomes inseparable from that dream. When he is imprisoned, tortured, and broken, he loses more than his body. He loses the future that justified every wound he had endured. Then comes the Eclipse. Most people remember it as the moment Griffith betrays the band of the Hawk. But psychologically, something even more important happens first. Griffith is offered relief. Not justice, not redemption, relief. The God hand never forces him to choose. Instead, they present a horrifying bargain. Surrender everyone who loves you, and your suffering can end. That temptation reveals one of Berserk's darkest truths. Despair doesn't always destroy people. Sometimes it simply makes terrible choices feel reasonable. Griffith's transformation into Femto isn't random evil. It's the final consequence of believing that a dream is worth any sacrifice. When unimaginable suffering destroys that dream, sacrificing everyone else becomes the last extension of the same belief. Pain becomes a transaction. Humanity becomes the price. But Berserk doesn't stop with Griffith. It immediately introduces his opposite. Guts suffers almost constantly. Betrayal, trauma, loss, isolation. Every chapter seems determined to ask how much pain one person can survive before breaking. Yet unlike Griffith, Guts repeatedly refuses shortcuts. He doesn't escape suffering. He carries it. The enormous Dragon Slayer isn't just a weapon. It becomes the physical weight of everything he refuses to abandon. Every scar, every memory, every loss remains with him. Instead of erasing his pain, he learns to keep walking despite it. Even the brand of sacrifice reinforces this idea. It never disappears. There is no miracle that restores what was lost. The wound stays open, and so does the choice to keep living. If Griffith and Guts were the only examples, this might simply be a story about two men making different decisions. But Berserk repeats this pattern across its entire world. Rosine doesn't become an apostle because she craves power. She becomes one because she wants to escape the horror of an abusive childhood. The Count accepts damnation after the unbearable betrayal of his wife. Different lives, different pain, the same decision. Again and again, Berserk suggests that monsters are not born from suffering itself. They're born from the belief that escaping suffering is worth absolutely anything. This is where Berserk reaches far beyond fantasy. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer argued that suffering is woven into the human condition. We constantly pursue satisfaction, only to discover that relief is temporary before another desire takes its place. More than a century later, modern psychology reached a surprisingly similar conclusion. Acceptance and commitment therapy argues that psychological suffering often becomes worse when people desperately try to eliminate painful emotions instead of learning to live alongside them. In other words, our obsession with escaping pain can become another source of pain. Berserk visualizes this idea through every apostle. Each one accepts a bargain that promises freedom from unbearable suffering. But the escape is always an illusion. Griffith gains power, yet loses every meaningful human connection. Rosine finds a fantasy world, but never truly escapes the fear that created it. The Count saves himself once, only to become trapped in an even deeper prison of guilt and damnation. Their suffering never disappears. It simply changes shape. That's what makes Griffith so terrifying. Not because he's uniquely evil, but because his choice reflects a temptation that exists far beyond fiction. Seen this way, the Eclipse becomes more than Berserk's most shocking scene. It becomes the story's moral center. Every major character is forced to answer the same question. When suffering becomes unbearable, what remains that cannot be sacrificed? For Griffith, the answer is almost nothing. For Guts, the answer slowly becomes the people he chooses to protect. One escapes pain by abandoning his humanity. The other preserves his humanity by accepting pain. That's why Berserk refuses easy hope. It never promises that suffering will end. It only asks whether becoming someone else is really worth escaping it. Think back to the beginning. We started by asking who the real monster in Berserk truly is. After everything we've seen, the answer isn't hiding inside the Eclipse. It isn't waiting among the apostles. It isn't even standing beside Griffith. It's hiding inside a question every human eventually faces. When life becomes unbearable, how much of yourself would you give away just to stop hurting? Berserk's answer is haunting because it never pretends that choice is easy. It simply reminds us that the moment escaping suffering becomes more important than preserving our humanity, the transformation has already begun.